Welcome to TezTalks Radio. I am your host, Marissa Trew, and today I am joined by the Funny Guys, otherwise known as Jan, who is an avid NFT collector and the co-founder of Larandom, an art institution focused on showcasing and celebrating the history of generative art. So welcome to the show, first of all. How are you?
Hey Marissa, nice to see you again. I'm all good. How are you?
I'm grand. Thank you so much for joining. I know it's always a tricky thing scheduling across time zones, and you're also a very busy guy because there's a lot to dig into when it comes to Larandom and how it's grown over the past couple years. But to kick off the conversation, we'll start off where we always do, which is to focus on you. Can you tell me about your journey, not only into the NFT world, but how you sort of came into Tezos and then became a collector?
Yeah, sure. Where should I start? I actually discovered NFTs when I was still at university, 20, and it was first like not through the art collecting route. It was first like through this um like basketball collecting game called NBA Top Shot. That took my interest for like a few weeks, but then in January 2021, I quickly discovered art blocks. I had no idea what I was doing, but I was minting ringers by Dmitry Cherniak. I sent some ETH to like this address on the blockchain. I received unique art pieces in my wallet. And for me, that was like really like a light bulb moment because I was exploring the NFT space. Like I was looking for applications that made sense. And for me, this was like the first time that art on the blockchain like truly made sense. Like I saw the synergies between the type of art and the blockchain technology. And I would say that ever since then, I've been mostly focused on generative art and collecting generative art. And of course, that quite quickly brought me to the Tezos blockchain. I think I started collecting there, if I remember well, in September 2021. And that's simply because some of my favorite generative artists were releasing work there. I believe the first pieces I collected were artworks by the Japanese generative artist, Kyubibi. And then I also quickly went on to collect some pieces by Manolo, the Argentinian generative artist, who is one of my all-time favorite artists. So yeah, if they mint on Tezos, of course, I had to follow suit and I started collecting there. And since then, I haven't really left the Tezos ecosystem. I'm still very actively collecting there, both for my personal collection, but also for the random.
So it's interesting because a lot of people who came to Tezos sort of started exploring the art world and then uncovering all of this talent, while you very much found the artist and then followed the artist to where they were minting their works. But you also got into the generative art space, I would say, ahead of kind of its boom, which came later that year, or actually even the following year in 2022, 2023. So what was it that kind of was it the Chromie Squiggle that kicked off your first interest in generative art? And what was your understanding of it when you first encountered it?
That's a good question. I actually kind of missed the Chromie Squiggle mint. I think that happened I'm correct, that was in December 2020, and I didn't really know about art blocks back then. So for me, it really was Ringers by Dmitry Cherniak, which I believe was maybe the 31st of January 2021. Well, anyway, like around that time period. And yeah, that to me, like that demonstrated like the power of like generative art on the blockchain. I heard about Tezos, I believe in March 2021, when like Hicket Nonk was like just getting started. But back then I was really focused on collecting on Ethereum. I didn't have like that much time to look into like everything on Tezos. So it took me like a few months to like realize that it was like something super special that was happening there. And at first, I must admit that I also had some concerns like about the blockchain. Like I felt safer, like just collecting on Ethereum, which was like the default and like the most secure blockchain, the most well-known one. It also had like very good application support, like a good wallet, like all these things. But after a few months, like I realized that what was happening on Tezos was quite unique. That it was already culturally very significant. And I believe that that will like transcend the blockchain. Like I think now Tezos with like all these millions of important artworks is like the cultural relevance is like set in stone at this point. So I have no issue like collecting on Teslas now.
So talk to me about how you began to amass your generative art collection, particularly, Tezos NFTs. What was sort of the process you went in with beyond kind of generally finding the artists you like and then finding pieces you liked? Was there, the this appetite to look for something that could appreciate in value? Was it artistic value? Was it financial potential? How did you go about acquiring these NFTs? What was sort of the mental model you went in with?
Yeah, it was, I would say it was at first, it was very much about experimentation and just like discovering like interesting niches, discovering interesting artists. As I just mentioned, like first, like the very first pieces I collected, like it was very much because the artist was already there. I already loved the artist's work, and I had to come to Tezos to collect the pieces that I enjoyed most. But then I stayed around for, yeah, I think a variety of reasons. I think most importantly, because it just was like a super unique space with like a lot of super important artists creating really interesting work. They were also like releasing work that was, I would say, more experimental, that was like more like pushing the boundaries compared to Ethereum. I think that's also because it was like Tesla was always like very like grounds up, like community driven. The financial barriers were also a lot lower. Like the gas fees like never spiked to a crazy amount. There were never like unrealistic expectations when it came to making certain sales for artists. So yeah, that was like for me like the main driver, like just the very interesting cultural and artistic scene. Financially, to be honest, I wasn't really focused on like on Tezos, I was never like really focused on financial returns. I would say I'm still not really interested in that on Tezos. I got quite lucky on Ethereum, especially with art blocks. Like I got lucky to mint ringers, to mint Fidenza, like for like $100 or something like that. And that appreciated quite well. And then I sold some of these pieces and I reinvested like all of that capital. I would say probably mostly on Tezos. I'm confident that maybe in 5 or 10 years from now, like some of the artworks on Tezos will also have a good amount of value. But that was never like the short term focus of my collecting.
So then when it comes to the way you appreciate generative art, of course, we can look at the aesthetics, and to the more sophisticated eye, you can also look at the quality of the code. But what is it that makes a generative art piece successful or profound in your point of view?
Generative art piece. Do you mean like just like one output, like one image, or a system as a whole?
I would actually argue both because, of course, there's the sophistication of the system as a whole and the ability to generate multiple outputs. But there's also, every once in a while you find that single output that really speaks to you, and that's, the piece that you collect. So what is it that goes into the way that you appraise the quality of generative art?
A good generative art piece. Maybe there's something to that it has to have like a nice balance between chaos and order. I feel like also like that is both true in my opinion when you look at like an individual artwork, but also when you look at a system. Like if it's too chaotic, like then it doesn't really bring you to peace. Like, just a lot going on, like you don't really understand what's going on. There's nothing that like ties it together. But if it's too orderly, then it gets quite maybe a bit boring, especially in a system that maybe like all the outputs look very similar. But I think a lot of the successful projects, a lot of the good projects, like they really found like this special balance between order and chaos. And that's maybe a very vague answer. I hope it does.
No, 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 I like it. I like that it's about the ratio between order and chaos. So if we were to bring this conversation closer to Lorandom, which launched, I want to say, a couple years back. Can you talk me through what was the vision that led to that creation, and why did you feel it was so important to have this platform, to speak and to represent generative art?
Yeah, sure. I think it's important to maybe like look back at the time periods, like when Lorandom was launched to like understand like why it exists. So I was working at that moment at Metaversal. Like I was there, one of their like analysts, helping them acquire NFTs, also helping them like invest in companies like in the NFT space. Um, but for me, when I looked at the NFT space back then, I think most collections, whether these were like individuals or corporate collections, most of them like were really like all over the place. Like they would collect like gaming assets, they would collect PFPs, they would collect like all sorts of digital art. They would put it all in a collection, and that collection would be an NFT collection or an NFT art collection. And to me, that never like really made sense. Like the collection didn't really like it wasn't a cohesive whole. Like it didn't really tell a story. For me, like generative art like was always within the NFT space, the movement that really stood out, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation. Like that was for me the movement that had like a real synergy between the arts and the technology. So with Random, like we really like set out on a mission to focus on generative art, to give it the context that it deserves. And we do it through like a few different initiatives. Of course, we have our collection, and the collection is really focused on building out a historical archive of generative art. It's not solely focused on what's happening like right now in the NFT space, but we also try to acquire works by pioneers from the we have like this framework of like 3 generations. So we have like the first generation of pioneers who created work, let's say like between the 50s and the 90s. We want to collect their work because we think they're like super important in telling the story of the generative art movement. So we've collected work by artists such as Frieder Nake, Vera Molnar, Herbert Franke. We acquired one of his NFTs on Tezos, actually. Then there's a second generation of generative art, like people from the 1990s till like, let's say 2015. And then there's a third generation from 2015 till now. So we have this framework and we try to collect artworks that represent each of these generations so that hopefully when people look at our collection, it helps them understand like the entire lineage of the generative art movement. And we can help convince them that this is not a flash in the pan, that this is actually a movement that already has demonstrated its longevity, that already has shown to be relevant for 7 decades now. And hopefully this context that we can bring to the generative art space, hopefully that also helps it grow and helps it become like more significant over time.
I think that was all very, very well said. I think what really struck me when I first went onto the platform was understanding how much material there was to celebrate not only the current and the contemporary artists, but the sheer amount of history that actually underpins generative art as a movement. Because I think when something's sort of co-opted by Web3, we forget that there's a lot more history that happened before blockchain technology. So it's
Totally.
always it's always wonderful to celebrate and recognize that, you know, these aren't Web3 trends. These are things that have found a place in Web3 and found utility in Web3 in order to preserve these qualities of works. When it comes to educating people about the history, is the aim to essentially encourage people to simply appreciate it more? Is it to encourage people to begin collecting artworks, or what sort of the end goal would you say for the random?
The end goal of the contextualization efforts, like the editorial efforts.
Or more just the platform in general? Or when we talk about the contextualization efforts, are we talking about this continued education so that people can keep up to date with the movement as it evolves?
Yes, yes. Okay, let me maybe before answer this question, I do want to stress that, um, like maybe one of the most important things I did in 2022, like was bring, like this like small team together. It's like the 4 of us like working on it. So there is, myself, like I started the venture together with a friend of mine, Zach, who leads like the operations and the financial efforts. And then there's Conrad House and Peter Bama, 2 people that I hired actually from the Tezos community. One of them is known as Monk Anthony, the other one is Nemo Cake. Conrad House, Nemo Cake. I work like really closely with him on the collection. Like he's our collection lead. So together we build out the entire the random collection. And when it comes to contextualization efforts, like that's very much like spearheaded by Peter Baumann, Monk Anthony. Like he leads both like the editorial that we have at Lorandom, but also the timeline of generative art history. And for us, like from the start, like that was a really important like pillar of the organization. We from the start like wanted to do more than just passively collecting the digital art, because I think that's what most organizations do or most collectors do. We wanted to like actively tell the story of generative art, of the history, also of what is going on at the moment. Also trying to look maybe a little bit ahead of like what's happening in the future, or like what future technologies artists are excited about. And we hope, that all of this together can maybe serve as some type of framework or a tool set for the community to make sense of the generative art movement. And hopefully also to bring more people into the mix and give them also like this framework to like actually understand like why all of this is relevant, why it has value, why it also like relates to like the current moment in time that we're living through, why it's interesting to think about. And yeah, I think the collection and the editorial efforts are actually really, there's a nice synergy between them in demonstrating this. We can show the beauty of generative arts. Like we can show like all the artworks from like across all the decades that we've collected. But at the same time, we also have all these written pieces. Peter has created like this framework of demystifying generative art, where he goes through like different aspects of generative art, such as the systems or the aesthetics, and he helps people like with this like framework to understand and analyze like each single aspect of generative art. He also has created like this timeline, which at the moment I believe comprises more than 1,000 moments across 10 different chapters, which again like serves as like material to show like, look, this is not just a trend. Like this is actually something that's like very, I would say, like innate in human beings to create systems that can create art.
So largely what we're looking at is there's the educational pillar, but there's also very much an editorial pillar, and then there's the artwork itself. So when it comes to, not only representing generative art through the decades, what also goes into considerations when collecting generative pieces? What's sort of the, I guess, curatorial criteria to how you expand the collection over time?
Yeah, it's a good question. So as I mentioned earlier, like we have this generational framework, like these different generations. That's something we do use a lot, like when thinking about generative art. We try to, when we look at an artwork, when we look at an artist, like we're trying to like situate them in time. And then we try to understand, like, is this a piece or an artist who has like really like helped move the movement forward, like who has made like, let's say, like significant contributions to the generative art space. And when we talk about that, like these can be like very wide ranging discussions. Like I think sometimes people think that we use like a scorecard where we give maybe like points like every different dimension. Like that's not actually how it works. Like we always start with like a discussion about like the artist's career, like about their background, to like really understand like their practice, like what they're trying to say. And then we look at the artworks themselves. If we think the artist is, let's say, like a relevant figure, and then we try to like find out like which artworks are the most significant, like the most iconic. And depending on the artist, like there's a whole, like it can be like of various different reasons. I think some artists are like very significant because they maybe like pioneered like new systems of creating generative art, that it might be interesting to look at that type of work that they also release. I think other artists are very visually driven, don't really want to have like a concept around their practice. Then there's like a more like subjective analysis of like what pieces do we think are like the most significant ones, like which ones resonate most with us. Sometimes the artists are a lot more focused on the concepts. Then we of course like analyze these. So yeah, it's a tough question to answer. It's quite, for us, it's quite I would say like a messy process. Like we take a lot of different factors into account, and we always, like with the entire team, have like very long discussions about the artists, the artworks, and by the end of those discussions, like we typically have a good feeling of like whether we want to acquire their work or not, and for what price, like these different variables as well.
I mean, I think it being messy is probably a good thing just because it ensures a diversity of pieces within the collection. And,
Yeah,
that's always a
exactly.
good thing.
Maybe one thing to also highlight is like with the collection, like also from the start, like we wanted it to be like a super diverse collection. I think the easiest thing to do, like when you start like a corporate like digital art collection, is to like just buy like the blue chip names, to just buy pieces by, let's say, Tyler Helps, Rafik Anadol, maybe buy some Chromie Squiggles, and leave it there. Like nobody's going to blame you. Like you just bought let's say like the blue chip collections. It's a very safe thing to do. But for us, like we were always focused on the entire generative art movement. And it is a very diverse movement like in itself. Like it is being practiced like across the globe. It is being practiced by artists from like so many different generations. There's also a lot of different sub niches like within generative art. It's not all just, let's say, like these like long form collections. Like there's so much more going on. There's artists who are focused on, let's say, on artificial life. There's a lot of like interesting ST art. There's a lot of artists who focus a lot on let's say interactive drawings, interactive artworks. There's artists who like focus on plotter drawings. Like there's all these different like sub niches that we all want to highlight. So for us, that really resulted in a collection that is like spread across the globe. Like we have collected work from more than 170 artists from like every single continent across the world, which we think is like a really nice way to like celebrate that it's a like a movement that happens on the internet, like wherever people have access to computers, like they create generative art. And we also have collected now more than 1,200 artworks. So yeah, it's very different than I would say like most corporate collections that focus on the blue chip names.
So, talk to me about the discovery process because, as you've just mentioned, you've amassed a massive collection, but it's an incredibly diverse collection. And steering away from the classic blue chip pieces and going for perhaps the underrepresented or the lesser recognized, but still high quality pieces, they're harder to find. You have to do a fair bit of digging to uncover those hidden gems. So, what does that process actually look like?
Yeah, I think that's again like this discovery process is again one that is like very like curiosity driven. I think for us it's really about like obsessing over generative art and like spending like an enormous amount of time like just being active like in the generative art space and following like all the threads that people leave for you. I think it's like super easy to maybe like start with like one artist that really inspires you. Let's say for example like the example of Manolo, like right away, like he captivated my interest. If you then look for like interviews that he has done, like he mentions like his main inspirations, you can look into those artists. They might also mention like who they are most interested in, most inspired by. In the blockchain space, like it's also super easy to see what other artists collect or to see what other collectors are collecting. That's also something we actively do. Look into the collections of like other people in the space that we admire. So yeah, like for us, I would say that's like one really important part of the discovery process. Just like following all these threads that people do leave behind. It just takes curiosity and time investment to find them. And then I think one thing that we also really want to do a lot is to be active like in the present moment. There's like a lot of innovations happening. Like for example with FX Hash, the entire random team like was there like the first week like it launched, we started experimenting with it and we started collecting work on FX Hash since then. And I believe that's like often the case in the like digital art space on the blockchain. There's almost every few months, there's like a new project or there's like a new interesting collection. And you just like always have to give it a try, just look at it, experiment with it, and maybe it sticks. Sometimes it doesn't, and that's fine too. But yeah, like being active and always like embracing these new innovations. I think it's also like a super important part of the discovery process.
So it's effectively finding various rabbit holes and just digging into them.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's also like a really nice thing about the random Steam is that we all do it in different ways. Like Conrad, for example, I think he's like quite like visually driven. Like he spends a lot of time on websites such as Arena to look at like the visual inspirations of other artists. He often tweets about them, like shares them. Peter Baumann, of course, like obsesses over the history of generative art. So very often, like he comes to us with like a discovery of like a certain artist that we may have never heard about, but that he's like very adamant about that they made like super significant contributions. Quite recently, like he was like really studying the early like GAN art scene. I think he like was mostly excited about the figure of Alec Redford. But in that process, like he also discovered like some other artists, such as like Ryan Murdoch, for example. He then brings that back to Conrad and me, and we start digging like if we can collect their work. So I would say like that like all the activities that we do at Random, but they all help each other, like they reinforce each other in a very nice way.
So, given you guys have a hawk eye on the way this space is evolving very much in real time, what are some of the innovations that you've actually seen within the generative art space over, let's say, the last 3 to 5 years or since, you began? How has the genre sort of refined itself or become more sophisticated or become more diversified?
That's a good question. I think one trend that we have seen like play out over the last years is that artists are getting like closer and closer to the, let's say, like the raw material, like working with blockchain technology. I think most artists, like when they started out, like they released NFTs, and I think they were like not like hyper aware of like what they actually were selling or like what exactly like the art object was. So I think a lot of them, like they placed like images on centralized servers, or they just placed them on IPFS. But over the years, I think a lot of them have gotten a lot closer to the blockchain itself. And now over the last months, like we're seeing a lot of artists that release like work that is like not only fully on chain, but that also plays with like other aspects of blockchain technology. Like for example, Kim Asendorf, he released like pixel decks. He issued like his own token called like the pixel token. And every pixel token symbolizes one pixel in the visual artwork. And that's for me, like that's a concept that was quite unimaginable like 3 years ago. Like there wasn't really artists like playing around like in such depth, like with blockchain technology. And I think that's actually being repeated across the ecosystem. Like for example, sorry. There's, for example, Leander Herzog, who released like Infinite Garden, which again is like a very like blockchain native way of creating generative art, where you can merge different gardens, you can gift flowers to other collectors. I heard that. Well, maybe I shouldn't say this, but that Marcelo Soria Rodriguez, he's also working on a new system that is like fully on chain on the Tezos blockchain, where he wrote like his smart contracts himself to create like a very innovative work of generative art. So yeah, that's for me probably one of the main trends over the last years. Art is just getting a lot closer to the raw material of the blockchain.
So effectively what we've seen is generative art, at its primitive level, all the way back, what was it, did you say 7 decades ago, to generative art being minted on chain, and then now generative art very much being fused with that chain to some degree or other. And there's like a technical convergence there that is probably never considered the realm where art would go before, but it's very interesting to see how those systems are converging and what the output actually looks like, and whether, to the naked eye or to the uneducated or to the generative art novice, we'd be able to appreciate just how technically sophisticated that is.
Yeah, exactly. I think generative artists, like also in the past, I think they were always looking for, or they were often looking for like a native way to like sell their art. And I think some of them, well, they went through like different phases. Like there's phases where they were trying to like completely, or some people were like trying to hide the fact that there was like a computer involved because they were too, maybe not ashamed of it, but they would think it like self-sabotages because the art world was so against like computers and art, like that doesn't go together. It's like a contradiction in terms. Then at some point, like some artists, like they actually on the backside of the artwork, they would maybe like print out the algorithm. So they were already looking for ways to like bring the algorithm and the visual artwork together. Sometimes they would like they would sell the algorithm like on let's say like a hard drive, like or on a computer, and the collector would acquire this entire like computer, this installation as the generative art piece. But yeah, now with blockchain technology, they can actually do it like in the, I would say like the most like beautiful way possible. They can place the artwork, the algorithm on chain. All the visual artworks can be derived from that. Yeah. I believe that's like for generative art, it's like the best way to be presented. And it was probably completely unimaginable, like just 10 years ago, that would eventually exist. Like such a great way of presenting generative art.
I think it's also interesting going to your comment about, I guess we could call it the stigma against digital art in many ways, or that if you were to use a computer to produce something that was aesthetically pleasing, it would somehow demean the quality of the work. But I think what we've seen over the last few years is this growing appreciation of digital art. I think it's maybe been a little bit muddied by generative AI and just what people are able to create and where artist attribution lies within that process. But have you seen any conflict, any synergy between how AI and generative art are developing alongside one another?
Yeah, it's also a good question. Well, I think first of all, with generative art, like one thing that's interesting is that 2021, we were really fighting against like generative art being like a synonym of PFP projects. There are like a lot of PFP projects, like Bored Apes, that would sometimes even frame themselves as generative art,
Yeah.
which, I mean, they have some aspects of generative art, but it was quite annoying for, I would say, like a full-time generative artist. And now we have a similar issue with generative AI. Like if you use the word generative, like people always think of generative AI. They don't think of like, let's say, procedural generative art, where the artist like writes the algorithm themselves, like in a, yeah, like a procedural programming language. So yeah, but that aside, I do think one of the most interesting things that happened like over the last few years is the rise of generative AI. And for us at Lorandom, AI art like, has always been like part of generative art. I think like generative art is really about artists that create systems that maybe cede some control like to these systems to create art with. And AI art can be used like in exactly the same way as procedural generative art in that regard. But with generative AI, well, it's both. How do I say it? Like there's both a negative and positive side to it. Like it's really easy for people to create visual objects, but the most the most interesting artworks with AI, like they don't typically use generative AI, just like in this like plain cut way. They typically experiment with the technology like on a very deep level. And a lot of the AI artwork that we acquire, they're actually from artists who have been interested in AI for a very long time, sometimes more than a decade. And we mostly acquire like artworks that I would say like precedes the like generative AI moments of, I don't know, like 2 or 3 years ago. But we also acquire some works that are being created with like modern tools. They create like interesting work with it. I think there's like some artists that use generative AI, that they try to like critically examine like how the systems work, how, let's say, like certain cultures are represented in these systems. We think that's super interesting. Yeah. But in general, like we acquire work of AI artists who have like a very intimate conversation with the technology. They typically like collect their own training sets, train their own neural networks. And then it's actually quite close to procedural generative art. It's like an end-to-end system that the artist has created.
So it kind of comes down to the complexity of the interaction, whether they actually produce the ML system themselves or control the output, control the input to a degree, rather than simply prompt output mint
Yeah, exactly.
being the core
Yeah,
process.
I would say so.
So a lot of our conversations revolved around the evolution of generative art over the last 3 years, and obviously Lorandom has grown in that time. So what does the next evolution of Lorandom look like? What can you share?
Yeah, so I think Loredum as a business, over the last years, like we have like really focused on like building out the brands, building out the collection, like building out like the entire like editorial side of the company. But now like looking ahead, like we do want to find, I would say, maybe like a more like sustainable business model. We do want to like actively generate some revenue, and there's a whole variety of ways that we can do so. Like it's a bit difficult to talk about it right now because we're like still trying to figure out like exactly what the next step is going to be. But I think in general, like people will see the random as a maybe like a more active contributor to the generative art space, and not so much as a passive collector. Or, well, not that we're like fully passive, like we try to be active as collectors as well and as publishers of editorial material. But yeah, I think looking ahead, we'll make some more active contributions and hopefully become a self-sustaining business in the process.
So a lot of it's to do with just continuing to champion the space and pushing it forward, as well as, pioneering some of the tools and, I guess, in a way, integrations that are going to help that particular section of the art world thrive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think it has become very clear to us over the last years that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in the digital art space to continue to grow and to like reach like wider audiences. So yeah, I hope we can make some contributions there. I hope in the future we can look back and say that we actively push the space forward in that regard.
Along that vein, though, how have you seen the relationship between traditional art institutions and platforms like Lorandom shift over time? Because obviously, during peak NFT art boom, institutions became more curious than ever. Has that institutional interest died down at all, or what are you seeing from your position?
Yeah, I would say for us, the institutional interest has only grown over time. I would say that in 2020, like during like the NFT boom, as you just said, I think a lot of the institutions were quite skeptical. Like expectations were like overly inflated for them. It was like too boomy for them to like really engage with it. Like it felt like just like a bubble, which to some degree it also was. So maybe they did well to not engage like too actively in those days. But ever since then, like in 2023, 24, now also in 2025, like we've already seen like institutional interest increase. For example, for us, like there's now an artwork in our collection that is being shown at the Tate as part of the Electric Dreams exhibition. And for us, that was like totally unimaginable, like when we started in 2022. Like we had maybe hoped that that would happen, I don't know, in 2030 or something. But for that to already happen in 2024 was like a very big surprise for us. And yeah, we've also been in touch with a lot of other institutions, like for example, like the VNA, like they are like very actively embracing digital arts. Like they're doing a lot of programming around digital arts. And yeah, there's examples like that, like all over the globe, also in Asia, in the Middle East, North America, like all over the globe. There's a lot of institutions that are now, I would say, like doing quite ambitious programming around digital art. And I think they really needed the market to calm down because only then it was safe for them to engage with it. So I hope that over the last years, like we've laid like the institutional, let's say, like groundwork for the space to like continue to grow and to see like more institutional programming.
I think that's amazing. And I think that the fact that the institutional players have sort of continued to tick away in the background without needing to make their progress within the digital art sector sort of up front, center, and loud, and sort of feeding into that initial bubble is arguably the much more sustainable approach to making sure that digital art sort of gets the recognition that it deserves, generative art in particular. One final question I have for you, and this is a bit of a cheeky one, which is whenever you watch the Larandom collection expand, do you ever have these FOMO moments where you kind of wished you had added it to your own collection? Or how do you make the decision when you find an art piece that you love, whether it's more suited to Larandom or more suited in your own personal archive?
It's indeed a tricky one. Well, I think the rule is obvious. Like the random always gets like first priority. And again, like it's important to know that like I'm not the only one like building this collection. Like Conrad, like he has like also like over the years like become like more and more like the leader of like the collection side of things. So whenever we see an artwork or we see a collection, like Conrad and I always discuss like what is the optimal thing for the random to do? Like what are the optimal artworks for the random to acquire? And that's always what we do first. And only after that, the question of like, should I collect something from my personal collection comes into the mix. And I also have to say that because I don't sell a lot of digital artworks, like my personal like financial means compared to the random like is also just a fraction. So for most artworks, the tension doesn't even exist.
I think that's a very, very fair way to approach it. Well, Jan, thank you so much for your time today. It's been illuminating to learn a lot more about how Larandom has grown over the years, but also just how generative art is evolving. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Marissa. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yes.